Hello, my name is Grant Imahara, and it is 11:03 on Thursday, April 1st.
He spent his career building things that could make people gasp. A working R2-D2, a robot that could hurl itself through the air like a stuntman, a mechanical bunny that never stopped drumming. He was one of the few people Lucasfilm trusted to operate the real Star Wars droid on set. Millions knew his face from a show about blowing things up in the name of science. And then, on an ordinary night in the summer of 2020, his own body betrayed him in a way none of his engineering could fix. This is the story of Grant Imahara, the quiet genius who spent his life bringing machines to life, and the sudden, devastating way his own life came to an end. Grant Imahara was born on October 23, 1970, in Los Angeles, California, into a Japanese-American family. His middle name, Masaru, means victory, a name that would end up fitting a life built almost entirely on quietly outworking every obstacle in front of him. Long before the world knew him as a television host or a Hollywood engineer, he was simply a curious kid in a Japanese-American household in L.A., the kind of child who wanted to know how everything worked, not just what it did. That curiosity became the defining thread of his childhood. While other kids were playing outside, Grant was taking things apart: radios, toys, small appliances, anything he could get his hands on, just to understand the mechanisms hidden underneath. It wasn't destructive for its own sake. It was the earliest sign of an engineer's mind, one that needed to see the gears turning before it could rest. That instinct, paired with real discipline at home, set him on a path that would eventually put his hands on some of the most famous props in movie history. Like so many kids of his generation, Grant's imagination caught fire the moment Star Wars hit theaters. The droids, the practical effects, the sense that a galaxy far, far away could somehow feel mechanically real. It captured him completely. Where other fans were content to own the action figures, Grant wanted to understand how something like R2-D2 actually worked. The servos, the wiring, the logic behind every beep and blink. That fascination with Star Wars wasn't a passing childhood phase. It became a through line that connected his boyhood bedroom all the way to a soundstage in London decades later, when he'd be the one called in to fix the real droid when it broke down on set. By the time Grant reached high school, and then the University of Southern California, the pattern was clear. He wasn't just interested in machines. He was becoming genuinely excellent with them. He enrolled at USC to study electrical engineering, chasing a very traditional, very serious career path. But partway through his time there, something in him pulled toward a completely different world: storytelling. Grant loved movies enough that he seriously considered walking away from engineering altogether to pursue screenwriting instead. It's a detail that tends to get lost in the engineering prodigy version of his story, but it says a lot about who he actually was. Someone who loved both the technical and the creative sides of filmmaking, and for a while, genuinely didn't know which one he wanted more. The person who ended up settling that question for him was Tomlinson Holman, a professor at USC School of Cinematic Arts and the engineer behind the THX sound standard used in movie theaters worldwide. Grant began assisting Holman, and in doing so, discovered something important. Engineering didn't have to mean choosing science over storytelling. It could be the thing that made storytelling possible. Watching how precise, technical work directly shaped how audiences experienced a film reignited his commitment to engineering, but now with a clear sense of where he wanted to point it. He finished his degree in 1993, and the path Holman had shown him led directly to his first job. Grant was hired straight out of USC by Lucasfilm's THX division, the very standard his mentor had helped create. As a young engineer there, his job was exacting and unglamorous by Hollywood standards, testing speakers and audio equipment against strict specifications, making sure theaters and consumer products that carried the THX certification actually delivered the sound quality that certification promised. It was detail-obsessed, painstaking work, but it was also his foot in the door at one of the most storied companies in entertainment. That door opened wider in 1996, when Grant made the jump from THX into Industrial Light and Magic, the visual effects division Lucasfilm was actually famous for. This was the move that changed everything. Most people working in ILM's model shop came up through art or traditional model-making backgrounds. Grant came in from a different direction entirely. as an electrical engineer who understood circuits, motors, and control systems, as well as he understood how to make something look convincing on camera. That combination made him unusually valuable. Over the next 9 years at ILM, his fingerprints ended up on an extraordinary run of films: the Star Wars prequel trilogy, The Lost World, Jurassic Park, the Matrix sequels, Terminator 3, Van Helsing, and more. His specialty was giving props their pulse, the circuits, lights, and motors that made physical objects on set actually move, glow, and feel alive. It was during his years at ILM that Grant's path crossed with the droid that had captivated him as a 7-year-old in a movie theater. Lucasfilm needed someone with real electronics expertise to maintain and upgrade the aging R2-D2 units in its archives, and Grant's technical skill made him a natural fit. That responsibility grew into something rare. He became one of only a small handful of people in the country officially trusted to operate the actual R2-D2 unit at Lucasfilm events and productions. When the droid broke down during production of The Phantom Menace, it was Grant and a small team of specialists who were called in to solve the problem, replacing worn-out components, improving the wheels and drive system, and making the notoriously temperamental droid more reliable on set. His work only expanded from there, eventually putting him in charge of upgrading the entire fleet of R2-D2 units used during Attack of the Clones, redesigning the droid's internal lighting and electronics along the way. Alongside his Star Wars work, Grant was building a reputation as one of ILM's most versatile technical minds. In 1999, he served as chief model maker on Galaxy Quest, where he engineered the custom circuitry that gave the film's fictional spaceship its glowing, shimmering engine effects, a purely technical solution to a purely visual problem, which was exactly the kind of work he seemed to love most. Around this same period, Grant also started building things purely for the fun of it. He designed and competed with a combat robot named Dead Blow on the television series BattleBots, later returning to the show as a judge. He co-authored a book on building combat robots, and in one of the more unexpectedly charming credits of his career, he engineered the internal mechanism that gives the modern Energizer Bunny mascot its signature rhythmic drumming motion, proof that his talents translated just as easily to marketing gimmicks as they did to blockbuster visual effects. By 2005, Grant had built an impressive, if largely behind-the-scenes, career. That changed the moment he stepped in front of the camera. MythBusters needed a replacement after builder Scotty Chapman departed the show, and Grant was invited to join through his connections with the production, including his friendship with co-host Jamie Heineman and a former ILM colleague who was working as a producer on the series. He joined the build team alongside Carrie Byron and Tori Belisai, and over the better part of a decade, the three of them became one of the most beloved trios on television. Grant brought something specific to that team, a genuine engineering degree and a rigor that balanced out the show's chaotic, curiosity-driven energy. His colleagues affectionately called him the geek of the group, not as an insult, but as an acknowledgement that when a myth needed real technical precision to test properly, Grant was usually the one who could make it happen. Over more than 200 episodes between 2005 and 2014, audiences watched him build remote-controlled rigs, program electronics, and solve absurd technical problems with the same seriousness he'd once brought to speaker certifications and movie props. It was a strange, wonderful use of a Hollywood engineer's talents, and it made him a household name in a way that 9 years at ILM never had. The MythBusters years weren't without real risk. Working with explosives, heavy machinery, and improvised rigs meant the build team occasionally found themselves in genuinely dangerous situations, and Grant was no exception. It was demanding, sometimes hazardous work, dressed up as entertainment. The kind of job where a small miscalculation could have serious consequences, and where the team's technical caution was often the only thing standing between a fun experiment and a real accident. In 2010, while still a fixture on MythBusters, Grant took on an independent side project, designing an animatronic robotic sidekick for late-night host Craig Ferguson. The result was Jeff Peterson, a robot skeleton that became a recurring, fan-favorite character on The Late Late Show. Another example of Grant quietly building something delightful just because he could. Then, in 2014, the MythBusters build team's run came to an end. Grant, Carrie Byron, and Tori Belisai all departed the show together after that season, a decision reportedly driven by budget cuts at the network. It was a jarring shift for longtime fans, who had come to see the three of them as inseparable from the show's identity. Grant didn't disappear, though. In 2016, he reunited with Byron and Belisai for White Rabbit Project, a Netflix series that let the trio dig into strange historical and scientific curiosities, from jailbreaks to Cold War-era heist technology to bizarre wartime inventions. The show earned solid reviews and a loyal following, but Netflix opted not to bring it back for a second season, and the reunion ended after a single run. Rather than slow down, Grant kept finding new places to point his skills. Starting in 2017, he began quietly consulting for Walt Disney Imagineering on a project he wasn't allowed to talk about publicly. The secrecy lifted the following year, when Disney revealed the fruits of that work, an experimental acrobatic robot called Stickman, which used a simple pendulum-driven launch mechanism to perform mid-air somersaults. Grant was credited as a co-author on the research behind it. That early prototype eventually evolved into Stuntronics, a line of self-correcting, autonomous animatronic figures capable of performing genuine aerial stunts, technology Disney planned to build into shows and attractions across its theme parks. It was, in many ways, the perfect capstone to a career spent making machines move like they had a will of their own. And then, in what turned out to be the final months of his life, Grant returned to something purely personal. Working as a consultant for Disney Research and as a mechanical designer, he spent 3 months in early 2020 designing, programming, and 3D, printing a fully animatronic Baby Yoda, complete with blinking eyes and a tilting, turning head. He wasn't building it for a studio, a paycheck, or a fan convention. His plan was to bring it to children's hospitals, to give sick kids a few minutes of pure wonder. He finished the project in March 2020, roughly 4 months before his death, without any idea that it would become one of the last things the world remembered him for. Grant's personal life, unlike his very public resume, stayed largely out of the spotlight. He had been in a relationship with costume designer and actress Jennifer Newman since 2011, and the two became engaged in 2016. Those who knew them describe a private, steady partnership, the kind of relationship Grant seemed to prefer, quiet and grounded, in contrast to the very public nature of his television career. Then came July 2020. In the days leading up to it, Grant had reportedly been dealing with severe, painful headaches, the kind of symptom that's easy to write off as stress or exhaustion, especially for someone used to pushing through physical strain in the name of a project. He kept going about his life. Nobody around him, including the people closest to him, had any reason to suspect that something catastrophic was building quietly inside his skull. On July 11th, 2020, that changed with terrifying speed. Grant became critically ill and was rushed to the hospital, where doctors determined the cause, a ruptured brain aneurysm, a condition that had gone completely undiagnosed until that moment. What followed was a desperate, 3-day fight. Grant underwent emergency surgery and survived it, but he never regained consciousness. A second surgery followed, with the same devastating result. By Monday, July 13th, doctors performed an MRI in preparation for a third operation and found that the damage to his brain was simply too extensive. There was no path back. After consulting with his family, the decision was made to remove him from life support. Grant Imahara died that day, July 13th, 2020, at the age of 49, one of the most sudden, shocking celebrity losses of a year already defined by loss. The response from the people who knew him was immediate and heartfelt. His MythBusters co-star Adam Savage described being at a loss for words, calling Grant a brilliant engineer, artist, and performer, but above all a generous, gentle person to work alongside. Carrie Byron and Tori Belisai, who had spent nearly a decade beside him on 2 different shows, said they were heartbroken and in shock. Byron noting that the two of them had been on the phone together not long before the news broke. Discovery Channel and Science Channel honored him with a 2-day marathon of his best-known work. Even in the world of tabletop gaming, Dungeon Master Matthew Mercer paid tribute on the web series Critical Role, naming a tinkering non-player character, Imahara Joe, in his honor and calling Grant one of the loveliest people he had ever known. What made Grant's death land so hard wasn't just the suddenness of it, though that was part of it. It was the contrast between how he died and how he had lived. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life understanding failure points, in circuits, in mechanisms, in systems, and engineering around them. He'd made temperamental droids reliable. He'd made robots move safely through the air. And yet the one failure that mattered most, hidden deep inside his own body, gave no warning signs he or anyone around him could act on in time. His legacy didn't end with his death. On October 23, 2020, what would have been his 50th birthday, his mother, along with friends and former colleagues, including Carrie Byron, Tori Belisai, and Adam Savage, announced the creation of the Grant Imahara STEAM Foundation. Its mission was a direct extension of the mentoring Grant had quietly done for years, including his long-running work guiding a high school robotics team. The foundation provides mentorship, grants, and scholarships to underserved young people pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, art, and math. The same blend of disciplines that had defined Grant's own unlikely career, from THX certification labs to Star Wars soundstages to a television set where he built robots for a living. In August 2021, more than 80 props from his years on MythBusters, some of them built by his own hands, were auctioned off to help fund that mission. There's a particular kind of sadness in Grant Imahara's story that goes beyond the shock of a sudden death. It's the sadness of someone who spent his whole life quietly building things meant to bring other people joy. A droid millions of fans loved, a robot skeleton that made a late-night audience laugh, a tiny animatronic baby Yoda built for children he'd never met, right up until the very end, with no idea his own time was running out. He never got to see that last robot make it to a single hospital room. He never got to watch Stuntronics debut in the theme parks he'd helped make possible. He simply kept building, kept mentoring, kept working right up until an ordinary dinner turned into the last night of his life. Grant Imahara didn't just work on some of the most iconic machines in movie history. He spent nearly 3 decades proving that engineering could be an act of generosity, that the same precision it takes to calibrate a loudspeaker or wire a droid's logic board could also be used to make a sick child smile, or a robotics team of teenagers believe they could build something extraordinary. That's the legacy that outlived the tragedy. Not just the robots he built, but the people he built up along the way.